Welcome to the Natasha Helfer podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
I'm Natasha Helfer. I'm a relational and sex therapist. This is my podcast where we try to attack shame and get healthier through education, stories, and relationships. And I am thrilled to have Lucie Fielding as my guest today. You and I have crossed paths, in several spaces, mostly through AASECT and for many years. And I've just been thrilled with your work and your presentations and just super excited to have you on the show today. I guess to tell people a little bit about you, and then I'd love for you to tell a little bit more about yourself, that you are the author of Trans Sex, which is a groundbreaking book for clinical approaches and working with trans and non-binary folks, and have your training as a clinician. And so you hold an MA in counseling psychology. And what makes you, I think, really unique is that you have a PhD in French, which, why that matters, you write just in this phenomenal way. And I think, whenever you have a degree in some type of language arts, you people just, you say things just so phenomenally. So I'm just always, when you take clinical things and then you say them either poetically or phenomenally, it just moves me. So I'm just very happy to know you and to know how you kind of navigate the world of language, and especially in this world of therapy and clinical practice. So that's what I love so much about reading your stuff.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for, allowing me to be in conversation with you today. And, another thing that I would add to that as to why at least I talk about the PhD, because it's not a clinical degree, is that I think that there's a long tradition in sex therapy and sex education of trying to ground everything in social science and in medicine. Whereas for me, I'm really, really attuned to stories, to images, to metaphor, and the ways that stories and scripts and images are constantly bombarding our bodies and informing and forming how we embody eroticism, how we embody gender. And so I'm a humanities femme. It's important to me that we are not only highlighting the stories that the cultures in which we are moving try to tell us about our bodies and about our sexualities and our genders, but also the ways that we can tap into the stories that our bodies want to tell, that may be separate from, and that often are separate and different and unique and exquisite, in ways that the stories that the cultures we move in, about us aren't.
Yes, no, I love that. And I think what you bring to this book, Trans Sex, is your professional expertise, but also your lived experience. And you say that right off the bat, as a trans femme, you have lived this experience. You've gone to your own therapy, processes. You've dealt with clinicians. You've dealt with a lot of, I think, both positive and negative spaces where you were looking for your own treatment. So that gave it a really, I think, unique perspective that we don't always have in the field, for sure. Is there anything, before we dive in, which, because I know you'll interweave your story along the way, but is there anything in particular that you just want to let us know about yourself or your story at large that just kind of tells us a little bit more about Lucie?
Well, because I think it's important to talk about social location. You know, I'm white, I'm queer, I'm neurodivergent, I'm kinky, I'm polyamorous. I am a transmisogyny affected femme. I live and work on Monacan land, and sometimes I find myself on unceded Duwamish land. Otherwise known as, under their colonized names, as Central Virginia and Seattle, Washington, respectively. And I recognize that I am a settler many times over. I'm Jewish, I'm witchy, I am, so that's my social location. And I think that it's important to start with that because I think sex and identity are two things. I think about what my dear friend Doug Brun Harvey talks about with respect to sex, and how if we as clinicians, as educators, as counselors are uncomfortable talking about sex, then our clients, our students pick that up, and that forecloses a lot of conversation. And similarly, if we do not bring identity into an identity constellation into the conversation from the very beginning, then we're not recognizing that our work is incoherent without reference to it.
And it's interesting that it's through people in, I guess from marginalized populations, people like you, people like Black clinicians who have really started having this conversation about disclosure of identity. Mm-hmm. I think most of us were trained, especially in the clinical world, we're trained kind of under, kind of like definitely white European, this process of you're a blank slate, you're not supposed to share anything about who you are. There's almost this protective factor of the client, but also protective factor of the clinician, right? So, it's fairly privileged perspective. And that's been really challenged. So I do think it is challenging for clinicians to be like, whoa, wait a minute. Now we're disclosing all of these parts about ourselves, not just, what you just disclosed was a lot of very personal information, right? About your sexuality, about your identity. And a lot of people might be like, oh my goodness, I can't just go out there and share all these personal details. Can you talk a little bit about that shift and why that's so important, especially for marginalized clients?
Well, first of all, I serve small communities within a small community. I'm a therapist in a rural or semi-rural environment, and I'm a member of many of those communities. And so a couple of things. One is that people seek me out precisely because I'm a member of those communities. And so being out as kinky is something, for example, that allows kinky folks to find me and to recognize that in all likelihood, if we work together and they just bring up something casually about their play or about a kink that they have, that I'm not going to make it a thing. I'm not going to try to link it back to some kind of childhood experience or try to say this is oh, well, I know that you came in to talk about depression or anxiety, but we're actually going to talk about this because I really want to know why, this is important to you. And so we're overriding in that case, what a client is coming in with. But the other thing is that I think that the collective trauma event that is the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic is, should give us pause about neutrality, because, we have been in this moment the last 3 years where we are in the same collective trauma events as our clients, and no one is okay. And to pretend otherwise by like hiding behind a blank screen, or to, like not bring the social and the political and the cultural into the room with us, is to, can be enormously invalidating for a client, because, they're experiencing this stuff. And if we are not, acknowledging that that's a thing that is impacting their lives, that is impacting ours, then that really, we miss out on an opportunity to join with our clients and to say, like, you're not alone in feeling this sense of, in trauma language, that you feel a sense of being in a thwarted intention between, like, I can't freeze, I can't run, I can't fight. I can just I'm just in neutral for 3 years. And the impact that has on our bodies, on our nervous systems in particular. And to, not acknowledge that, that it has an impact is I think it rises to the level now of being morally unconscionable. Quite honestly. I think that it's important for our clients to know that we're human. Now, granted, like, we, of course, we get to have boundaries around that, like, just because, I note certain things about myself doesn't mean that I'm not also considering, like, is this useful in this moment? Why am I self-disclosing? Who is this for? In this case, it is clinically useful because I'm trying to join with a client, and I'm trying to note, like, where are some levels of similarity, where are some levels of difference, and, like, let's have a conversation about this, because this is vital to informed consent as well. Because you need to know, like, is this going to be something that we need to process, that we need to discuss? And of course, I'm, considering numerous factors in terms of what I am disclosing. It's not for me, it's for the process, it's for the relationship.
Yeah. And I also enjoy what you say in the book, that even if you're not kinky, or if you're white, or if you're monogamous, and you're disclosing those things, just the openness of disclosure signals to your client that I'm open to having these discussions. So even if we don't have all of these, markers being identical or the same, that we're open to having this kind of fluid conversation about identity. And so important to me. I was literally training to say, if somebody asked me, well, are you married, or do you have kids, or, like, these things that people care, people care, like, can you relate to me, is basically what they're asking. Can you relate to me in this particular way? And I was trained, I don't know, 25 plus years ago. So I age myself, but, to say something like, well, why is that question important to you?
Mm-hmm.
Why is asking me that question important, without disclosing anything about myself? And I remember feeling quite uncomfortable with that, answer. But anyways, I'm glad that we're moving into this kind of more joined space of mutual knowledge and information, which I do.
Well, and one more point about that before we move on is that I think that it's important because, like, if I end up in the same event as somebody, again, small communities within a small community, chances of me either unintentionally, as in when I run into my therapist at the grocery store on Sundays, or, intentionally, insofar as, like, we're at the same event, we're at a play party, for example, like, it's important that we know that that's going to happen, so we can each make a decision as to, like, whether we're going to go to that event. Like, I need to be able to decide, like, okay, is that event way too small and and would that be uncomfortable for me to go? Or is it large enough that like we can avoid one another? Or like what happens when we do see one another, so that we have a game plan in mind that, like, what's our story?
Yeah.
What am I going to do, and how are we going to process it afterwards?
Right. I love it. Okay. Well, diving right into some of your language, let's start with the term embodiment. You have a lot to say about that. I think it's a word we use a lot these days. I'm not exactly sure we suss it out much. So it's kind of what I'd like to do with you. Embodiment. Yeah. Tell me how you formulate that word.
Well, so there's two senses of it that I think are really important to talk about. The first is when we talk about embodiment, it's that we are in bodies. And, it's the recognition that we locate ourselves first and foremost in bodies. We're moving through the world in bodies. We have viscera, and that we are attuning to the stories that our bodies are telling us and attuning to that, including the pleasure stories. And then there's the second sense of embodiment that I kind of alluded to at the very beginning, which is when we say that we embody something, when we embody an ideal, when we embody a narrative or an image. And so that brings in this idea of the ways that stories are impacting our bodies, and to what extent those stories get internalized and shape or inform or form how we conceive of, how we imagine into what it is to have a body, and what it is to have a body in gender, or a body in eroticism.
And we live in spaces where culture has a lot to say about that for us.
Mm-hmm.
I think from a very early age, right? We get messages about gender stories, about biological stories, about, especially here in the United States of America, a very binary story, about vaginas and penises and men and women and what it means to be any one of those things, and with not a lot of space in between. And so I think this is obviously what the trans community is challenging us to rethink, as far as more of the privileged spaces. But this has been, something that's been around forever. I think a lot of people have this conception that trans community is new, that this is a new phase, that this is a new thing that somehow our country is for the first time going through, and misunderstanding.
We're going through a phase.
Yes, the rich history and diversity of humankind. We're missing the whole history. So I start maybe with some of that, just kind of bias or stereotype of story, and how we seem to be stuck in a certain current narrative.
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between the terms and the experience of gender expansiveness, or the experiences of gender expansiveness. The terms are of recent innovation. So like the term transgender, for example, is really one that goes back to the 90s, the 1990s, and non-binary, the various terms that we use. However, we can locate gender expansiveness and gender play in just about every culture in recorded history, and there's so many ways of conceiving of gender and sexuality. And many cultures, many indigenous cultures, for example, don't even see a distinction between sexuality and gender. And so it's important to note that that part of the story here is about white supremacy and colonialism. and particularly from like the 18th century on. So these are very recent innovations. The whole idea of, for example, sexual identity dates back to, I think, 1867. I mean, that's how, like, this idea that 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 sexuality is an identity that we hold. However, you know, there's all sorts of play and expansiveness and fluidity, and it's important to note, like, you know, just the ways that our stories shift and morph and change over the centuries, over the millennia. And so there's a long sweep of history documenting this. I mean, you know, like you mentioned genitals, like, you know, we map certain stories about sex and gender based solely on the presence of one of these structures, like in a sonogram. So before a child is born, they're having all of these kind of, you know, gender stories thrust upon them, you know. So like, just because there's a presence of, say, a penis doesn't tell me anything about that person's embodied experience. But there's all these stories that are kind of rushing in to make all sorts of claims about it. My friend and colleague Emily Nagoski talks about, we did a workshop together about a year ago, and she told the story about like this anglerfish, where like the in terms of mating, that the male anglerfish kind of like attaches itself and gets basically absorbed into the body over time of the female anglerfish. And the exercise was, you know, like, what stories, you know, come to mind about this anglerfish? And, you know, and the participants had all these things about, like, well, you know, I wonder if the male angler, how the anglerfish feels about being absorbed into the female anglerfish, you know. And it's like all these stories about feelings and about, you know, and these ideas about like how these two fish are relating. So like the presence of like of certain structures doesn't tell me anything more than what we're mapping onto it, the stories that we're mapping onto it, onto those structures. So, you know, like bodies, I like to refer to our bodies as polymorphously perverse playgrounds of wonder, which is to say that, like, you know, our bodies, you know, like,
break down that term.
Yeah. So, so credit where credit is due. The term polymorphous perversity comes from Freud. It's one of the terms that I love from Freud. Said a lot of bullshit, but I do love this term. But basically what he was trying to describe there was the phenomenon that the genitals are not the only erogenous zone on our bodies, and that indeed our entire bodies can be erogenous zones, can be sites of pleasure. And so it's just that we, you know, these stories about our bodies, you know, it's like, okay, well, there's a penis, and so the only good penis is a hard penis that's penetrating something, you know. Whereas, like, you have to understand that, like, that penetration itself has really nothing to do, that penetration or hardness doesn't have anything to do with pleasure. It just has it. There's certain mechanical, uses to that, in terms of delivery of genetic material in terms of procreation. But like, for example, the nerve endings are still there on on a penis. Like, you don't need it to be hard in order to access that. So you can have, like, I'm fond of saying, you can have hours of mind-blowing sex with a flaccid penis.
Yeah.
And but it's the story that we tell and the values that we attach to certain states of being that I think harm us all.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really important to know.
Yeah, you talk so much about so many of these concepts, like sexual function implies genital function. The DSM-5, for example, is like kind of rife with this. And also your terms that I'd like to kind of dive into next, like desirability and desirability, which you also it's like fuckable versus fuckable, and all these ideas that we have about what it means to be sexual, what it means to be sexually successful. I constantly am telling people that probably the number one thing we're going to do in sex therapy is kind of blow up all the ideas you have about that are usually fairly rigid around what it means to be a sexual being, and how can we diversify that and find pleasure. I love your pleasure playground, that can be so much more. We forget how to play, right, as we grow up sometimes. And even, as you were talking about the stories we give to people just even before they come out of the womb, I've seen so many studies or even just little video vignettes of you give, a quote unquote boy baby, baby dressed in blue to a person, and a baby dressed in pink dress, same baby, but now you dress them in different colors and you give them to people and you watch them respond, these babies. And it's just fascinating, right? To see how we treat the baby, how we hold the baby, what we say to the baby, the tone of our voice as we, it's just shocking, quite frankly.
The emotional capacities that we invest in that baby. And, you really want your mind blown. Like the mapping of blue and pink onto gender and to gender qualities really has its basis in the 1970s and toy marketing.
Right.
So like, again, like the idea of there was a time in certain societies where pink was a very masculine color. And so we just, and yellow was seen as a more feminine color. And so like, whereas now we think of like yellow as more neutral, and pink is feminine and blue is masculine. And, like, what even does that mean? And how are we all harmed by what the implications of all of those stories are, and, to think nothing of like the amount of environmental catastrophe that has been caused by gender reveal parties. I mean, I think like 3 wildfires and counting caused by gender reveal parties. The lesson is don't have a gender reveal party.
Yes. Well, and I think the cost that you're talking about is erotic potential, right? So when you have to fit into a story box instead of opening up the story book, you limit erotic potential, right? And so I think you have a lot to say about what's considered desirable. I think most of us, all you have to do is like look at a basic Hollywood movie and you see the types of bodies, right? They're usually They're usually white. They're usually hygienic,
Then,
like hairless.
mhm,
They're, what else? I mean, they're usually
visibly able-bodied,
visibly able-bodied.
um,
There's
between the ages of 18 and 40, usually tall, fit,
slender.
whatever that means. So there's,
Which is also a misnomer, because in order to look a certain type of fit, most people are actually not necessarily living very healthy ways, to look.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I just have to go to the university gym and see you know, the folks on the ellipticals. And I think, yeah, there's so much body terrorism around that. And so to speak to desirability, I mean, so there's a couple of strands here. There's clinical literature that is talking about the impact of certain dynamics on attraction. So, for example, the ways that colorism operates, and how lighter skin tones, less melanated skin tones are valued on, for example, dating apps, and so studies around that. But where I get the most inspiration is not actually from that body of literature, but from folks like Hunter Shackelford, Deshaun Harrison, talking about the politics of desirability and this idea that, desire is not some idiosyncratic, subjective, I like who I like kind of thing. It's actually so very informed by our particular by the particular cultures in which we are moving, and that they are conditioning what is desire. And one thing I really like about Deshaun Harrison's work, The Belly of the Beast, which won the Lambda Literary Award this year in the trans nonfiction category. It's a brilliant book. And one of the things that I really love about their work is that they note how, desirability is not just like who is in romantic and sexual relationships and not, but it's also about like who gets jobs, who gets housing, who gets who gets bank loans, and things like that, and what are the terms of those loans. It's like it's the ways that we are making all sorts of assumptions about a person based on these characteristics that are valued in a particular culture, that are heavily informed by white supremacy and colonialism. And so that's desirability. It's who in a given cultural idiom has the capacity to be desired, right? Who is desirable. And then desire-able, that is a term that, that I'm really inspired by critical disability studies. And so I'm thinking about like the capacity to be viewed as a being who desires, who is a sexual being, who is an erotic being, and all that comes along with that. Who we say like, oh yeah, like, so like I think about the ways that we infantilize automatically and desexualize a lot of disabled folks. Like, oh, how do you have sex? It's like, well, actually quite well and quite inventively and quite pleasurably in fact, or with trans folks, like, well, how do we have sex? Well, again, we're ingenious. We know our bodies really, really well. And we have a lot to, like, I think some of my work is really about like, hey, cis and straight folks, like queer and trans folks, we have a lot to teach you about sex and about relationships. I mean, it's how many times do I, in meeting with like a cis straight couple, am I like, oh my God, the straights are not okay. Um so, in the sense of just like, oh my God, you play so many games with one another. Um and you know what is it about that? Why the investment in that? So
Yes, no, and I think that's true of older people, older people who are not seen as sexual. Um, you shared a statistic that cis heterosexual and LGBTQ folks at 87% indicated that they would not consider dating a trans person, which was really surprising to me that it was that high, considering the LGBTQ population as well. So that, there are a lot of misnomers about who, like you're saying, who gets to be sexual. I think even coming from like high demand conservative religions, sometimes people who, vagina and vulva owners who are raised as women get desexualized and not really seen as erotic, would impact their own inner narrative about who they are, sexual beings. There's just lots of places where I think we get robbed of our own erotic stories. Whether we're aware of them or not, right?
Yeah. Despite the fact that, the Bible actually has a lot to say, about pleasure and about how, everyone involved should be experiencing pleasure. That it's not just one member of that partnership who gets to have the pleasure, and everyone else involved in that dynamic is not, or whose pleasure is devalued. I mean, that's a huge aspect of Judaism, for example, and sexuality. Like it's one of many things I love about Judaism, and or particular aspects of it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that there can be a lot of sex positive teachings. I've listened to a lot of Judaic teachings on sexuality and definitely see the sex positive potentials there. And then of course it's the same kind of from the faith tradition I come from in Mormonism. There's a lot of sex positive potential. And then of course there's the culture that sometimes can take the more sex negative approaches that get internalized, unfortunately, instead of the sex positive aspects that get framed correctly, sadly. So a few other things before I want to move into just some of your own personal experience. But one of the things that you talk about that I thought was very interesting is, I mean, you talked a lot like sexual function implies genital function. So much of our focuses is on our genitalia or orgasm, or whether or not we're lubricating, or whether or not we're erect, all these like kind of performance style processes of sexuality, more pleasure. And I love that you reminded us all that the three most pleasurable parts of our body are our lips, our hands, and the glands of our clit or penis, correct? Yes. And so that's a lot of wonderful things you can do erogenally with two huge parts of your body that aren't even necessarily around your genitals. So I loved that. But one of the things, especially for people who are going through hormone replacement therapies, if they're starting to take estrogen or if they're starting to take testosterone, they can notice differences in what we might call like spontaneous and or responsive desire, which, that's normal because hormones are in place. But I think that this leads to a bigger conversation, regardless of whether or not you're on hormone replacement therapy, is that most of us will have a relationship with spontaneous and or responsive desire. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. I think, again, we have a lot of mindset about what type of desire we should be experiencing versus opening ourselves up to a variety of experiences around arousal and desire.
Totally. Thank you for mentioning that. I mean, the thing I always want to start with is like, I think that when trans folks and non-binary folks, gender expansive folks are involved, it's like cis folks forget that they're already doing so many of the things that, they're talking about trans people in relationship to. And so like one of those things is the idea that like whether or not you engage in any kind of like gender transition, like our bodies are constantly in transition. Like we're aging, and the composition of our physiologies are constantly changing, and our relationship to our bodies are constantly changing. So the context to which desire and arousal are and liking, and pleasure, are constantly changing. The context that those are responsive to. And so I always want to highlight that, like, because hormones are part of it, but it's like, it's more about like, where are you in a given day, at a given moment in your body? There's a sex educator who talks about, want, will, won't lists. And what she recommends is, or yes, no, maybe lists. And what she recommends is, as you're filling it out, sign and date it and timestamp it, because what you've written is only good for that day and that timestamp, and that it will change, because the contexts are shifting. Like you realize that, oh yeah, like something that I was willing to do, I no longer am feeling. Something that I'm wanting to do, something that I was willing to do, I'm now really wanting to do. And so I think it's important to talk about how contexts are constantly shifting. For trans folks, like the contexts that can be really important is that it's not so much hormonal composition as a context, but it's more like the extent to which I'm feeling yummy in my body, the extent to which I'm feeling affirmed in my body, the extent to which I am experiencing a sexually relevant or a gender relevant experience. These are all contexts that affect desire, that affect arousal, that affect liking. And so when I talk about our desire, our arousal, when we're talking about like subjective arousal versus genital arousal, when we're talking about liking, like whether I'm liking something at a given moment or not. So like, the example that Emily Nagoski gives is tickling, and it's like, I can like tickling in the context that like I'm already warmed up, we're in a sexy context, and maybe you start tickling me and it's like, ooh, this feels so yummy. And, but like if I'm having a bad day and you're like, tickle, 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 it's like, as she says, violence will ensue, because the context is totally different. So context is king here.
Yes, I would agree. I often talk about my nipples. Like there's certain times that you can touch my nipples really, really well, and there's other times I'll just knock you out. So
yeah,
on arousal, levels and who you are, and several things probably matter in that decision.
Yeah, like for example, like talk about like when is something a an orgasmic spasm and when is it a contraction? Like how are it's a very similar, I think it actually is an identical body process, but we think of it and experience a contraction very differently than we experience an orgasm.
Yes, no, that's a great point. A few other things. There's just so many things in this book that were helpful. So just pick it up. It doesn't matter if you're trans, straight, whatever. It's just a really helpful book, or if you're a clinician or not. But one thing that you talked about, I was talking to a pre-op trans woman, and she was telling me about just kind of body dysmorphia. And until the operation was going to happen, just, her relationship with her genitalia and how she was struggling in that regard. And, this is before I had read your book, and I wish I had read your book beforehand. I think I would have had more ideas. I was kind of more in the space of like, yes, it's fine to grieve and to, obviously to have, mixed feelings about your body. So I was, I think, definitely affirming. However, you had some really great ideas, because obviously not everybody opts to have operations for a variety of complicated reasons. But one of the things that you shared that I thought was just lovely is naming yourself in affirming ways that are yours to do, right? So you had some suggestions like, a vulva can be a man cave and a penis can be a clit, right? And like who we get to decide, right? Like we can have this self-authority to decide what we name our body parts and what feels good to us. Do you want to speak a little bit more about that concept?
Well, I think that that's yet another example of things that like cis people are already doing, that like trans people may just like turn up to 11, with even more like variety of names. But, I refer to my parts as my clit, but like how many, and that really helps me to kind of, like revision my relationship to that part. But like how many folks with vulvas who are cis, so how many women with vulvas do I have I encountered who have very, very clear ideas about and feelings about the word cunt versus the word pussy versus the word vulva. It's like do you, when you hear the word cunt, do you recoil? Does it cause you to lean in? Do you like pussy better? Do you like more kind of clinical terms like vulva much better? So this is yet another example of like all of us are, whether we're cis or trans, are already naming our parts in particular ways and have an attachment to that. But I think that really can have an impact. The ways that we imagine what a part is and what it can do, opens up considerably when we choose a different name, or when we decide that we're going to bring different energies and intentions to that part. I mean, we in the kink community know, for example, like the importance of energy and intention, that it's like when we're negotiating, it's not just like what kind of activity do we want to do? Like, okay, fine, we're going to engage in some spanking. It's not so much, that's not even the important question. The important question is, how do you want to feel when you're being spanked? Like, do you want to feel spanked and feel like competent? Do you want to feel broken down? And so like where I feel, for example, dysphoria is not so much around, the presence of a particular body part, but more like how somebody is interacting with that part, the energy and intention that they're bringing to that part. And so, for example, like I can tell if, like I think we can feel it, right? When somebody does like a body scan and they're like, okay, I know what to do with these. I know, I like these. They get down to the crotch. It's like, oh God, I don't know what to do with that. And it's like, well, just ask, have a conversation. You reference that statistic, 87% of folks wouldn't even consider dating trans person. A lot of that is transphobia and transmisogyny, but some of it, I think, comes down to fragility, a certain form of fragility around like, I don't want to fuck up. I don't want to offend. I don't know what to ask. So many people who I date who are cis are, like, I don't know if I can ask you this. It's like, honey, if we've gotten to the point that we are talking about like making out or going to one another's place, like, we can talk about what's going on in our pants, or what we want to go on in our pants, and so like energy and intention is really, really important. And so like when I feel that somebody approaching my clit with a beginner's mind, and again, this is something that we should all be doing, whether we're cis or trans and whether our partners are cis or trans. Like, if I am approaching a cis woman with a vulva, like, I'm not just saying, okay, well, you have a vulva. I've had sex with a lot of people with vulvas, and I'm just going to do the same thing that I've done, that one technique that I just do with all of the people I've had sex with vulvas. Like, that's not going to go over well. Like, of course, I'm going to ask, like, how does your vulva like to be touched? Do you like it faster or slower? Do you like, like more of a, like, the tip of the tongue versus, like a flat tongue, for example? What kind of pressure do you like? All sorts of questions, where we should all be approaching all of our partners' bodies, whether we're cis, whether they're trans, from a beginner's mind. And what happens when we do that? How much bullshit can we just avoid when that happens?
Yeah, I love this. And it reminds me a little bit of what you talk about. You talk a lot about ethical curiosity in this book. And that's, I mean, we could have a whole hour's discussion on just that, but it's basically the premise is that a lot of people, I think, ask really inappropriate questions, especially of trans folks. It's kind of like people think they have the right to information about people's bodies or people's sexuality when they're not part of the majority population, which is something we should all be checking. Kind of goes back to a lot of these kind of limited ideas or beliefs around bodies to begin with, or gender or sexuality. But what you're talking about is curiosity, ethical curiosity about being a lover and being a partner and being engaged. And this is where we don't ask enough questions usually. It's so funny, right? Like, we're asking and a lot of people will complain that, oh, but that takes the romance out of it, or that's awkward, or that's, and I'm like, oh, wow, so what might you say about that? How do you put the romance into ethical curiosity?
Well, I mean, what I've said to dates in the past is like, as I lean in close and whisper and use, coo into their ears, you want me to make that hot? I can make that hot. You can make that experience intensely hot. I mean, what's not hot to me is a guessing game, or being asked to read somebody's mind. The highest likelihood is that I'm either going to trip on like a trauma landmine, or I am going to, or you're going to walk away from the experience being like, eh.
Yeah, and I think it's exactly kind of like in the tone of the voice you just used. I think a lot of people, when they think about asking questions, they think it's like this very like, can I kiss you now? Can I touch you here? Can of like using the tone and the breath and the the volume,
Yeah.
and
Eye contact.
and yeah, and that's part of the seduction, right? And to use your voice and these questions as part of the seduction. So, all right, I know.
And like if you, sorry, yeah.
No, you go ahead.
Well, like, and if you can establish, like, if, for example, like if you establish, like, may I touch you? May I touch you in these ways? Then, like, you can add that into the negotiation too. And so, like, I can be like, so, so how would you like to feel when we're done playing today? How would you like to feel while we're playing? And so, like, I'm doing it. It's a play of eye contact and voice and touch and energy and interest, showing interest.
Yes. Okay. You're titillating me, Lucie. So let's get going. Zach Chase says you're blowing his mind and he loves you as a guest. So thank you for that, Zach.
My emphasis is on pleasure and finding pleasure in the body, and pleasure as resistance and reclamation, and not just sexual pleasure, but I just mean feeling yummy in your body.
I love that. And I think that's a wonderful place to end, is with that statement. Thank you so much for your time and for your energy.
Thank you.
Today. It's been lovely. Really lovely.
Thank you.
I'll take that invitation to think about what is yummy within our bodies.
Yeah.
Take care, Lucie.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the no, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. Of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the novel, so we can to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of home hand of the heart.